Hi, I'm Adam McMahen. I'm on staff here, and because Ben's not here, I get to fill in. And so, first, I've got a few announcements for you. And the first one is we would love to connect with you. There is a connection card to connect with you in the little pockets on the back of the chairs. Love for you to fill that out. And the offering plate gets passed just a little bit later in the service. You can put that in there with your name and information, and we'll follow up with you this week. Alternatively, there is a tent out there, and you can bring it by and say hi to the friendliest people at our church. Okay, I mean, they're at least equally friendly to the friendliest people at our church. Out there at the tent, and we have a little gift just as a way of saying thanks for first trusting us with your information and for wanting to connect with us. It's not anything too extravagant, but I mean, it's got like a pen, so that's nice. So I think it might not have a pen. There's a journal in there. I know there's a journal, and so please do that. We'd love to connect with you. Speaking of connecting with you, and related to that, there's a QR code on the back of the chairs, and you can sign up for, it's actually for Starting Point. You can sign up for Starting Point. Ice Cream Hangout's coming up. I'll talk about that in a second. But Starting Point is before that. In a couple weeks, we have Starting Point. It is a way for you to connect both with people who are new to the church and with some of the elders and staff members, and just learn more about the church. And so you can learn more about integrity. You can learn more, actually, any questions you have could be potentially answered. They can at least be asked there. And that's also your first step to joining the church. So if you're wanting to be a member, join the church, that would be a great step to connect, to get to know people, and get to know people before we start in the fall with small groups. So the small groups will be happening soon. Also before small groups, Ice Cream Hangout. If you want to go old school, you can call it an ice cream social. We won't judge you. That's what I keep calling it in my head. But we're calling it Ice Cream Hangout. You get to bring your own toppings to share with us. Come up with as creative of a topping as you want. So I can see your brains working, thinking about what you can bring, right? Okay, so you're not, but just bring something, and we'll provide the ice cream, you provide the toppings. If you were here last year, you remember how it all got melted. Well, we're going to try to change that up a little bit, and we're going to have the ice cream in the foyer where it's air-conditioned and cold, and we'll bring it out to, what is that, the pavilion? We call it the pavilion. And we'll eat out there. We'll play, if you want to bring wiffle ball or something, I don't know, play something. Y'all just... Zeke got excited. We're having wiffle ball. He's bringing wiffle ball. Maybe kickball. I don't know. We're going to have a good time. But we just want to do that, just hang out, connect with one another over the summer. We tend to get a little bit distanced from each other in the summers, and we're all traveling all over the place, and people are all gone. And so this is just an opportunity just to hang out. It's pretty informal, but it is a great opportunity for you to hang out, invite some friends, connect with your church family. So come out and hang out with us the end of July. You'll notice it's at 7 p.m., and we do that on purpose because the sun will be far enough over that the trees will provide a shadow, so it won't be feeling quite like 120, maybe just 98. So, that's amazing, right? There might even be a breeze. I can see Jason going, yes, I want there to be a breeze. And so, so those are the things that we're talking about. And now we're going to be talking about giving thanks today. That's the topic. That is the psalm that we're in, giving thanks. And this is kind of funny because every time I've been asked to preach up here, it seems to have been on a passage that's personally convicting to me, which just does not feel very nice. It's kind of annoying. So either Ben and the elders, they know me well and they're planning this out really well, maybe, or God's sovereign, maybe both. Probably more God's sovereign, but we get to talk about giving thanks, which is also very convicting to me. It's a struggle. I'll be honest with you. Giving thanks is a struggle to me. I don't know if it's because of my personality or family of origin, the way I was raised, but I find I'm not a very thankful person. I'm sorry for y'all who know me and can feel yeah, that's true. I'm not. But I thank you for listening to me. Thankful for that. But if you're into the Enneagram, which is, anyone know about the Enneagram? It's like kind of popular. I hear y'all. I see y'all kind of like barely raising your hands like, should I be? I don't know. What's he about to say? I'm an Enneagram 1, which the nickname is the perfectionist. So you kind of get an idea. Instead of like looking at things and being happy as they are, I'm like, all right, let's figure out how we can make it better. And of course, everyone else wants to be better because I want to improve everything. So that's a part of me. And then also people will call me a pessimist. I don't know why. I think I'm a realist, but people call me a pessimist. So there's that. Let me give you an example maybe to kind of clear up this. So I just got back from this vacation with my family to a New River Gorge in West Virginia. Has anyone been there? No? Oh, I got a couple guys. Okay. So if you've been there, you know it's like beautiful, right? I mean, it's gorgeous. We went whitewater rafting. We went hiking. It was a great trip. Our kids loved it. They actually loved whitewater rafting, which we're a little scared that they would just get terrified, but they loved it. But before we got back, all I could think about is like, how could it have been better? How could we have improved that? Like, I know we're not going to stay at that Airbnb again. That was not a great experience. That drive to West Virginia was way too long. We were too far away at the Airbnb from every place that we wanted to go. The fish, they weren't biting. It was too hot. I mean, I was full of complaints. On and on it went. But that's kind of my mindset if I'm not careful. And it's not helpful most of the time. Now, when we go to plan the next trip, it might be a little bit helpful, but it's not helpful most of the time. And that lack of gratitude kind of rubs off on others. And that mindset, it keeps me from experiencing the good that's happening all around. So when I'm not processing or focusing on giving thanks, it can be hard to be around me. It disconnects me from others. It disconnects me from the reality of the world and the great things that God has given us. So it's kind of hard sometimes. Now, I'm glad this is a safe place to be vulnerable. Thank you. I got one person that's like, yeah, you're right. Everyone else is like, no. But I want to think it is. And maybe I'm just saying that so the optimist in here will not come back and say, hey, you're messed up later. But I think this is a safe place. And I know that it is. And I'm not just sharing that because it is, but I'm also sharing because there's a lot of people in here that also struggle with that, right? That aren't great at giving thanks. Now, if you're an eternal optimist, and I know those people do exist, and I'm grateful for you, and you're starting to check out because you're like, oh, this is just for, what's his name? Stop elbowing the person next to you and saying it's for them. This is also for you. This is for you. And I believe this passage can help even you, eternal optimist in here, grow in giving thanks. I believe it can even help you. We can all grow in this area. So this is what the question that we're trying to answer is, how can we thank God in everything? How do we thank God not just for these like obviously great things like a Christmas bonus or good friends or being able to binge watch The Office? Okay, there's one person in the back that is excited about that fact. But also for the things that aren't great, right? So like things like that fight with your spouse or a friend stabbing you in the back, or when you have an illness that just doesn't go away, or when God feels distant, or when you can't figure out what God is doing right now. Like, how can we be thankful in those things? But here's a great thing is that we're not the first to struggle with this. And we're going to look into the Psalms for how we can thank God in everything. So if you have a Bible with me, turn to Psalm 116. If you don't, we'll have it on these screens as well, or you can open your phone and there's probably 50 different apps you can download for a Bible. So Psalm 116, and there's 3 sections to this psalm. The first 4 verses is the psalmist remembering suffering, remembering his anguish. And then the next 5 verses, 5 through 11, are remembering mercy. And the next 12 through 19 are his fervent giving thanks in response to this mercy and through this suffering. So let's read this together. I'll read it out loud. You can follow along, and then we'll dive into God's word. Psalm 116 says, I love the Lord because he has heard my voice and my pleas for mercy, because he inclined his ear to me. Therefore, I will call on him as long as I live. The snares of death encompassed me. The pangs of Sheol laid hold on me. I suffered distress and anguish. Then I called on the name of the Lord. O Lord, I pray, deliver my soul. Gracious is the Lord and righteous. Our God is merciful. The Lord preserves the simple. When I was brought low, he saved me. Return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I believed even when I spoke, I am greatly afflicted. I said in my alarm, all mankind are liars. What shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits to me? I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. O Lord, I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your maidservant. You have loosed my bonds. I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. In the courts of the house of the Lord, in your midst, O Jerusalem, praise the Lord. So at first glance, the psalm, it shows us something that the psalmist went through, something terrible, right? Something terrible, and he asked God for help, and then God saved him. And so he's going to thank God for saving him, right? I mean, it's a pretty simple, terrible, got saved, thank God for that. But it's actually more complex than that, so stick with me. It's not such a simple psalm or text. There's a lot more going on in the poetry here and in this psalm than just that. So first, let's look at his remembered suffering in verses 1 through 4. In verse 1, the ESV translators, they decided that the word love, that it needed to have an object, right? And so you see there, it says, I love the Lord. Well, in the original language in Hebrew, the way that it was written was something more like this. It's the phrase that read, I love because Yahweh has heard. So you've got, I love because Yahweh has heard. There's not a, what does he love? It's not saying what it is. And that sounds kind of weird, but if you look at 1 John, if you remember that passage, 1 John, you turn a lot of pages to the New Testament. 1 John 4:19, it says, we love because he first loved us. It's the same kind of language, same kind of phrase there, right? So you don't have an object of love. It's just saying that we love. Love is flowing from us because he first loved us. That's how we love. That's why we love. And that's the same kind of phrase here. So what the writer is saying is, I'm able to love well. I'm able to love greater. I'm able to love with my whole heart because Yahweh heard me. He's not saying that I love what I love. He's saying that I love in a magnitude, in a greater aspect because of God. And that name for God that's 16 times in this pretty short psalm, this name for God, it's Yahweh. This is the personal covenant name for God. And in the Old Testament, a lot of our translations are going to say that they'll have that in Lord in small capitals. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that I'm not going to get into all of it, but because it's kind of complex and I'm kind of nerdy and love it, but it might bore the rest of y'all. So that's a stand-in, though, for God's personal covenant name. His personal covenant name with his people, with the Israelites. And so this is the name that God revealed to Moses, right? In the burning bush, when Moses asked, what do I tell people who ask me when I go back to Egypt? What do I tell these people who are going to ask me who sent me? What do I say? And Yahweh says, this is what he says. He says, I am who I am. That's the word. That's Yahweh in Hebrew. I am who I am. And this is the name that Jesus references, that he says in John 8:58, when he's answering those who had said he's got a demon, right? They're saying, you have a demon. And instead of just rebuking them completely, he says, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was. So he's going all the way back to their father, the person that they say, we are the sons of Abraham. He says, before Abraham was, I am. And then what was their response? They tried to stone him. See, that's how personal that name was to them. That's how personal this name is. This is an incredibly personal name for God. And I believe that's how often Yahweh is used in this psalm, is because of how intimate this relationship was, how connected the psalmist was to God. There's this really tight relationship because of what he went through and because he knew that Yahweh had heard him. So look, verse 2, because he inclined his ear to me. That's like imagery of him hearing him, of him inclining his ear, of the great God, sovereign God, inclining his ear to hear him. And he says, therefore, I will call on him as long as I live. And so because God heard him, he's going to continue to call on Yahweh. And then in verse 3, we get a bit more of the details of what he's talking about, what happened here, right? He says, the snares of death, they encompassed me. The pangs of Sheol laid hold on me. I suffered distress and anguish. And so this is poetry, so even the details aren't that detailed. That doesn't tell us, like, we don't know if he was sick, if he had been attacked, if he was just left in a desert to die. Like, we don't know any of that. But we do know that this was like death coming up and trying to grab him down. And we know his emotions with this, right? His emotions are distress and anguish. This writer, he's really going through it. Whatever it was bad. So, like, if we were going to say something like that, we'd probably say, like, I nearly died. This was a near-death experience. This isn't some kind of hangnail surgery. This is like a deathbed situation. I'm not sure if I'm going to live or die kind of a situation. And so in the midst of that, in the midst of his anguish, his near death, verse 4, he calls on the name of Yahweh. And then again, and throughout this psalm, this kind of becomes a refrain where it says, I called on the name of the Lord. I called on the name of the Lord. It's repeated like 4 or 5 times. But he prays, O Yahweh, deliver my soul. Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's so poetic. It's beautiful. And is this some kind of bargain he's making with God, right? Is this some kind of deal with God that the psalmist makes? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, you probably have heard these stories or you've seen a movie. I read these stories a lot about people that go into the mountains and they're like completely unprepared. Like they go into the mountains in Alaska or in Colorado and they're unprepared. They do someone really dumb things. They go up in the mountains in the winter, maybe totally unprepared. They've got no coat or tent. Like maybe they got like food for a day, no map. It's somewhere they've never been before. And they're just going to the mountains. And they're like, I'm going to hike to this 14er. I don't care what the weather's like. They forget to even check the weather. And then the weather comes in and it's really bad. And they have no relationship with God at all. But about day 3 of them starving and freezing and all of this, they start making all sorts of deals, all sorts of bargains with God. And all of a sudden it's like, God, I'll sell everything. I'll give them to the church if you just save me. I'll become a missionary if you save me. I'll commit the rest of my life to you. I mean, you know how this goes. And then as soon as they're saved, like that is gone. Like they don't even remember having that conversation. They completely forget God and all the deals that they've made. So is that what's happening here? Is he at the end of his rope and he's saying, God, save me. Okay, he saved me. Yes, okay, we're good. Well, no, I mean, it's not that, because you can see this in the level of intimacy the psalmist has with God. In the love that he has, that he shows, this relationship was developed before this anguish, before this suffering that he went through. In fact, the anguish, it drew him near to God. It drew him nearer to God instead of bringing him further away. He didn't turn his back on God in this. This actually drew him near to him. Plus, he wrote a whole psalm about it, so he thanks God publicly, so that kind of shows you too. But that's a whole other thing. So this song is about him thanking God publicly. And so we love deeper because God listens to our cries. And we love greater because Yahweh listens to our anguish, our suffering, our distress, our prayers as we cry out to him in the midst of that. So then verses 5 through 11, the second point, remember mercy. So right after this, the psalmist, he just outbursts in praise of who God is. And we see this in verse 5. So it looks like he's been saved. And so he starts in verse 5 and he says, Yahweh is gracious. He gives undeserved gifts. He's righteous. God does what he says he will do. And then our God is merciful. He doesn't give us what we actually do deserve, which thank God for that, because what we deserve is not good. And then 6, Yahweh preserves the simple, the naive. He's identifying himself as naive. And he's saying, God's preserved me. Which brings the writer back to his story. You see, he was brought low and God saved him. So then verse 7, and he says, because God has saved him, he has dealt bountifully with him, he can rest. So how bountifully, how completely has God dealt with him? How generously? Well, look at 8. He says, you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I mean, he was in a bad way. Like, this was not good. But you've got to love this man's vulnerability. You've got to love this psalmist's vulnerability, his openness. It was from death that God delivered him. His eyes were tearing up. His feet were stumbling around, and God saved him. Now, I can't pass by this verse without talking about the gospel because it's just so clearly here. You see, the psalmist, he's talking about physical death in these poetic terms, but God truly has delivered our souls from death. Our gracious Yahweh sent his righteous Son to die on our behalf, to have mercy on us as Jesus Christ, the perfect righteous servant, died the death that we deserve. But he didn't stay dead. He was raised 3 days later in power, showing for those who believe in him that they will never die, that they will have eternal life with him. So that even though we may die physically, we will never be separated from God. So that we have the kind of intimate walk with Yahweh that the psalmist had. And so I want to urge you here this morning, believe in Christ, believe in what he has done for you, lean on him. If you've done that in the past, continue to lean on him. If you haven't, believe in what he has done. Talk to someone here who would love to share that with you. And I can tell you, as you call on him, he hears you. That is the promise of this psalm. And that's what the psalm calls us to do. And then verse 9, this next verse, he says, I will walk before Yahweh in the land of the living. You see, this is his promise. This is the psalmist's promise to Yahweh, that he will walk in the presence of Yahweh the rest of his life. So this could either be like demanding, or it could be a really reassuring thing, right? Because it could be demanding because in his presence, in God's presence, everything is revealed. Your darkest sins, your deepest secret, God knows all of it. But Yahweh's presence is ultimately and completely, it's reassuring when you realize that he's staying with you even though he knows it all. Even though he knows every bit, your deepest sin, your darkest secret, he is with you as you walk with him. And then the next phrase here in verse 10, it brings us back. It's a parallel phrase here because in verse 1 you have I love, right? And then this verse 10 says, I believe. And so he loved deeper because of this, and he believes greater because of this. His faith grew deeper through whatever happened to him, even though he was afflicted. Even though in verse 11, when he says, everyone is a liar, even though he knows he feels like he can't trust anyone but God. He's totally disillusioned and he's completely alone, but he knows that he had Yahweh. You see that? This suffering, this anguish, and this distress, rather than making him doubt God, rather than making him think that God is not in control, it draws him closer to him. I mean, this is an amazing psalm. Now, you can look at this and you can say, well, of course it did. He's writing it after, so God saved him from it, so of course he can recognize that. But if you look closely at the psalm, it's in the midst of the suffering that his love grows. It's in the midst of the suffering that his belief deepens. Even in the midst of calling out, I can't trust anyone, his belief is deepening in God. He calls out to God and his belief in Yahweh deepens. So an author I followed for a long time, his name's Pete Scazzaro. I think that's how you say it. He's Italian. I don't know how to say his name. Anyway, he's wrote one of his first books. It was called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. He wrote about this image that I think is really a really good fit. It's a really good image for us to think about. It's really helped me. It's called the wall. And so kind of picture this with me. I'll try to summarize. He wrote an entire chapter about it. I'll try and summarize this shortly. But without going into the details, I'll try this. In the image, there are seasons of life, right? Our journey of our spiritual life has these seasons. And as we journey through them, one of them is journeying through what Pete calls the wall. And let me read this quote to you. This is going to be it'll explain what the wall is, maybe. The wall appears through a crisis that turns our world upside down. It comes perhaps through a divorce, a job loss, the death of a close friend or family member, a cancer diagnosis, a disillusioning church experience, a betrayal, a shattered dream, a wayward child, a car accident, an inability to get pregnant, a deep desire to marry that remains unfulfilled, a dryness or loss of joy in our relationship with God. We question ourselves, God, the church. We discover for the first time that our faith does not appear to work. We have more questions than answers as the very foundation of our faith feels like it is on the line. So as we look at this, a wall would be something like Abraham waiting for 25 years after God has promised his firstborn son. A wall is Moses in the desert after trying to get his people to overthrow the Egyptians for like 40 years. A wall is God leading Abraham then to sacrifice his firstborn. A wall is Paul's thorn in his side. Another phrase that might be a little bit more familiar to you is the dark night of the soul. There was an ancient book called The Dark Night of the Soul written by St. John of the Cross. And in this, he explains what this looks like. So, and he's saying, like, how do we know we are in the dark night? How do we know that? Well, if you're in it, your good feelings of God's presence, this feeling that you have God's presence with you, it evaporates. We feel like the door of heaven has shut as we pray. You have this darkness, this helplessness, weariness, a sense of failure or defeat, barrenness, emptiness, dryness just descend upon us. These Christian disciplines that they've served us up to this time, they no longer seem to work for us. And we can't see what God is doing. We see little visible fruit in our lives. All of this is a part of the wall. So why, right? Why do this? Why would God push us through this? Well, St. John of the Cross answers this, Scazzaro answers this by saying that as we journey through this wall, what God is doing is he's purging our loves. He's purging our idols. These idols, like Mike talked about last week, these idols are passions after things other than him, so that we would delight in his love and we enter a richer, fuller, deeper, and more intimate communion with our Father. And so all of these other things that we might have passions towards, that we might worship other than him, they get burned away in the dark night of the soul. In fact, St. John of the Cross, who wrote that book, he actually called this aspect of it, he called it the dark night of loving fire. You get that? This loving fire that's going to burn away anything that keeps us from connecting with God. And the journey through the wall, it could last for months, or more likely years. But as God moves us through the wall, as we move through this and we look back on it, we find that we have this greater level of brokenness, a freedom from judging others, a deeper love of God and of others, a deep intimacy and communion with God that is a connection with him. We have a greater sense of thanks for who God is and how he works. And this is the experience the psalmist is showing us in this passage, in this psalm. You see, the psalmist, he experienced a wall in his life, and he was changed completely because of what God did through this wall. And this is how he can thank God, even in his suffering, even in his anguish, because he has a sense of why he's going through this. And so through suffering, we love deeper and we believe greater. Our love and faith grow as we journey through the wall of suffering. And so then point 3 in verses 12 through 19, we see this picture of the psalmist fervently giving thanks. He's giving thanks for what God has done. He's gone through all of this pain and all of this heartache, and he's been saved. And then in verse 12, he asks a question. He says, "What shall I render to Yahweh for all his benefits to me?" You see, what he's saying is, how can I repay Yahweh for all that he's done? How can I repay him for all the good that he's done in my life? He saved me. He saved my soul. He heard me when I prayed. Now my soul is able to rest. How can I repay him for all of that? And then the rest of the psalm is his answer to this question. The rest of the psalm is him saying how he repays God. So let's look at this. Verse 13, and he says he lifts up the cup of salvation. He shows to the world his salvation, the salvation that Yahweh gave to him. He's showing it to everyone. And then verse 14, he's going to pay his vows to Yahweh publicly in front of everyone, in the presence of all of his people. He's going to show this. And now notice that he doesn't, in the midst of this, he doesn't keep his salvation or even this intimate connection, this relationship with God. He doesn't keep this to himself. He has to share it. He shares it with the entirety of Israel. He tells everyone about it. In fact, in verse 16, he emphatically tells his God that he is Yahweh's servant. He says it over and over again, repeating it, "I am your servant. I am your servant." And then verse 17, he offers a sacrifice of thanksgiving. And he says again, he will call on Yahweh's name. And then in verse 18, there's just this repetition that he's going to pay his vows publicly in the presence of all the Lord. And then verse 19, he expands this beyond just all his people. He says, in the heart of Jerusalem, in the courts of the house of the Lord, in the temple in Jerusalem, the capital city, he's going to share this with the world. He's going to share this with everyone. He's going to say how thankful he is for what God has done. He's going to give thanks to God for how amazing he has done, what he has done. Okay, but in the midst of all of this, all of his giving thanks to repay God, we've got a verse that we have to deal with. Verse 15, you might have noticed I skipped it. And it says, "Precious in the sight of Yahweh is the death of his saints." Well, what in the world is that? Why is that here? I've got to admit, the first time I read that, I was like, that does not fit at all. This guy is praising God for saving him, and in the middle of that, we get the death of his saints is precious. Well, here's why he included it. See, he's pointing us to this fact that not everyone gets rescued physically from harm. Like, we can call to God, and he doesn't always answer our prayers the way that we ask them. No matter how faithful or how fervent our prayer might be, or how good of a Christian we are, that doesn't mean we're any less precious to God because he doesn't answer our prayer the way that we want it. Believers, saints, God's people are precious to him. And when we die, our death is precious to him as well. But thank God that even in our physical death, we are not separated from Yahweh. We continue to walk with him. So what the psalmist is saying is that even if he had died in this near-death experience, it wouldn't have changed his relationship with Yahweh. It wouldn't have changed his relationship with God. He would have stayed connected. He would have stayed his servant. He would have kept calling on Yahweh's name no matter what. So how do we keep this mindset of gratitude for what God is doing in our lives, even when it's difficult? How do we give thanks to God for the walls in our life, for the dark nights of the soul that we experience? Now, I've got to have one aside here as we're answering this question. I want to say we don't need to feel the need to put on masks of gratitude. We don't have to act like we're grateful when we're not. If you're going through a wall, if you're going through a dark night of the soul, please don't just act like you're grateful. It's okay to not be okay. There ought to be anguish. There was for this psalmist. There ought to be distress. There ought to be crying out to God and feeling like he's not hearing you. That is okay to express to us. You don't have to come on to church and say, oh, I'm so grateful. God is here. Like, if you're struggling, we want to hear that. We want to be here with you. As the church, we want to walk through that season with you. But even then, as we look back on our dark nights, we can see the benefits from those. And we can be thankful for them. Now, know that as you're going through them, because we know as we go through them, like, God is working in our heart to purify our soul. What a great thing. Know that God, he's causing your love to grow. He's deepening your faith, your belief. Know also that you're not alone as you experience suffering. The Bible and church history shows us tons of people that have gone through this. Integrity Church has so many people that have suffered, that have gone through this. Please know you are not alone. You don't have to keep this to yourself. You're not isolated. Open up. So as I was researching this sermon, I came across this blog post. And I found the distinction the writer made really helpful. And maybe it'll help you too if you're kind of like going through some suffering, going through some loss. The writer wrote this after the death of his mother. And he wrote, I have found a difference between being grateful for something and being grateful in something. My mother's death was a great pain in my life. And even these many years later, it looms large as a backdrop to my play. There is no gratitude for her loss. However, I have learned to be grateful in the loss, and that has made all of the difference. You see, we can give thanks in the dark nights and in our losses, even though we're not grateful for them. So suffering, dark nights, walls, they produce in us a greater love, a deeper belief, a deeper connection, so that we can be thankful even in the midst of them for what they are going to produce in us, even though they're agonizing. And if we can give thanks to God for working in and through our dark nights, we can give thanks for all the other ways that he's dealt with us, all of the other blessings that he's given us. So you might not be aware of this, but science actually has begun to catch up a little bit to what we know to be true from the Bible about gratitude. They've studied, neuroscientists study the brain, and they figured out all of this stuff of these benefits. So what they found is that when you express gratitude, your brain actually is going to releases two neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin, that are responsible for the feelings of happiness. So gratitude fosters actually a cognitive restructuring, and it begins to evoke positive thinking, and then it fires these new neural connections. And being grateful will actually reduce fear and anxiety by reducing these stress hormones just by being grateful, just by giving thanks. And then giving thanks, it also improves, this is wild, but they've studied this, immune system response. It reduces inflammation, optimizes blood pressure, cardiac functioning. I mean, that's a lot of reasons, in case you didn't get enough from God's word, to start giving thanks. But there's something even more powerful than all of that, all of this stuff that science is discovering, all of these stuff that the scientists are discovering, and it's what we see in this psalm. Ann Voskamp, a Christian writer, she says it this way. She wrote, giving thanks is the way we practice the presence of God. Stay present to his presence, and it is always a practice of the eyes. We don't have to change what we see, only the way we see. You see, it's all too easy to lose sight of God's presence when we're engaged in the realities of this world, when we're going through the tasks that we have to get done during the week, when things aren't working out how you think they ought to be working. But practicing gratitude consistently is how we stay connected to God and invite his power, his presence into everything that we do. And in the process, it changes the way that we see things. Gratitude gives us the eyes to recognize God's presence, his grace in these most unusual, these unexpected places, like the dark nights of our souls. So I'd like to leave you with something really practical. I've been struggling with this a lot of my life, and so I've found some different things that have helped me out. And this is the most helpful thing that I have found is just practicing giving thanks to God consistently. Here's a way that I've done it. There's this journal. It's called the 5-Minute Journal. If you Google it, you'll find it, 5-Minute Journal. There's a whole website, all this stuff, and it's like a hardback copy. I bought that for a while. But what you do is you do this daily thing. This isn't Christians that made this. This is like science. They were like, all right, science has shown us this. How do we practice gratitude more? Well, here's a way. And they come up with this. And it's been really good for me. You do this daily, and it's really simple. You start the day with 3 things you're grateful for. So you get up in the morning and you start your day and you say, okay, what am I grateful for? Well, here's 3 things. And you try to be as specific as possible. And you write these 3 things down. And then you end the day before you go to bed at night, and you end the day with 3 highlights of your day. What were 3 things that were good about today? And you write those down. And so what I've done as I've gone through this, and it's like a 6-month kind of journal thing, as you go through this, is I turn those things into grateful things, into a prayer of thanks to God. And so I don't just thank for nothing, I thank God for what he's done at the beginning of the day. And then at the end, I thank God for the highlights that were in my day. And so I want to just encourage you, try that out. It helps for me to have something of substance, but if it's easier for you to just like write it out or just to type it in a keyboard or whatever, like try that out. But try it out for a week and keep focusing on what you can be thanking God for in the midst of the week. Like even as no matter what you're going through, surely there's something that you can be thanking God for. I want to encourage you, try that out this week. See what God does, and as you try it out. So you can Google 5-Minute Journal, Google gratitude. Just try 3 things in the morning, try 3 highlights at night, and see what God has done in your life, what God is doing, what you can be thanking him for every single day. And then another practical application, and we're going to actually do this in just a second, but I encourage you to keep doing it. Psalm 116 is this incredibly deep psalm. There's a lot of depth in it. It's more than we could get into today, but I want to encourage you, dwell on it, think on it, dwell on it this week, pray through it. And we're going to do that in this as the band comes back up, but I want to encourage you to dwell on it, make them a prayer. And that's those 2 things, if you can do that, I think they'll be really transformative for you this week. So I want to encourage you, I want to urge you to do those things, do those 2 things, and see what God can do through you and in you this week. Let us give thanks to God for all that he's done in us and for us. And as Ben likes to say, God help us.